Okay, hello everybody. My name is Larry Fike, and this is a talk on basics of argument evaluation. It's going to be streamlined, very sort of without any frills. And the idea is just to be instructive about how to go about evaluating an argument. I teach a lot of critical thinking courses. I will tell you frankly that I think that a possible solution to some of the morass that we find ourselves in as a result of social media would be, ready for it, for everybody to pass a test on this material before they were allowed to use social media. Sounds kind of cuckoo, I know, but I think that the material here, in principle, is accessible to anybody age 12, maybe 9, but by age 12, there's nothing here in principle that can't be mastered if you sit down and think about it for a while. And if all of our vocabularies were peppered by the use of this kind of terminology when we went about assessing the claims made by other people, it would diminish the amount of disagreement that we experience, and it would also assist us in recognizing more quickly false claims that are being made. I think I've already used the word claim a couple of times. So a lot of this turns on standardization of vocabulary. In other words, we all just agree that when we use this term, this is what we mean. So what is a claim? Well, I'm not quite going to begin by giving a technical definition of it, so much as I'm just going to say that all and only claims are true or false. Now, sometimes we call these statements, but again, notice that I'm using pretty everyday vocabulary, right? So we all know what a claim is. Here's a claim, 2 + 2 = 4. Here's another claim. Trees require oxygen in order to thrive. Here's another claim, God exists. Here's yet another claim, God does not exist. Okay, and the idea is that even though we don't always know right away whether certain claims are actually true or false, we can still discern that it is in and of their nature to be either true or false. So if something is the sort of thing that can be either true or false, that's its characteristic, then what that thing is a claim, okay? I'm in a room recording this for my critical thinking students and hopefully for the entire world population at this moment is a claim that I just made. And then you might say, well, why should I believe that? And in which case, I would try to provide you with reasons for believing that my claim is true. Okay, now, declarative sentences are the common way in which we represent our claims, right? So in other words, typically what I do is I write things or say things like 2 + 2 = 4. I am now recording this talk on the basics of argument evaluation, and obviously I could just keep going. I'll put one more up here. It is January 16th, 2021. I like to do that. I like to sort of date stamp my talks. And so it is, in fact, January 16, 2021. So you notice that the marks on the screen don't resemble what they represent. They don't look like what they represent. They don't taste like what they represent. They don't sound like what they represent. They don't feel like what they represent. And whichever of the five senses I've left out, they don't that either. They are non-resembling representations, but we as human beings have the ability to abstract from these sounds that I'm making or the visuals that you might be accompanying to my voice at this time. And we actually understand. We understand that these things have semantic value. They are meaningful. So when we talk about arguments, we are talking about something that is not a matter of interpersonal or even intrapersonal disagreement, right? So the street sense of an argument is, like if I say, hey, those two guys over there are having an argument, the likelihood is that you're going to want to move away from it. But if you're in a philosophy class or you're engaged in critical thinking, and that's the context, and somebody says, hey, those two people over there are having an argument, then I might say, hey, what argument is it? Let me go in and take a listen. Maybe I can follow their argument. Maybe their argument is a good argument. And that's really the issue that we're going to focus on. But what do we mean then by an argument? This is what we mean. An argument is a series of claims, precisely one of which is the conclusion, and all the others of which are, I guess you could say but you don't really need to, are premises, okay? So an argument contains one conclusion, strictly speaking, for it to be a single argument, and then there's no upper limit on how many premises an argument contains as long as it contains at least one. Okay, and then now we encounter these all the time. So arguments are not something exotic. They're something that we do even in our own thoughts on a almost continuous basis, even though we don't often pay attention to the fact that that's what we're doing. So let's see, let me be arbitrary here and notice that I'm wearing my watch. So I might have at some point have reached the conclusion that I should wear my watch, right? Well, how did I ever arrive at that conclusion? Well, there were probably a number of steps that I took, even though I wasn't perhaps even consciously aware of them. They were still processes that had to go through my mind, in virtue of which I can explain the fact that I'm now wearing the watch, right? So one thing I might have said was to myself, I have a watch. If I want to be able to know immediately what time it is, I should wear it. And then furthermore, I do want to be able to know immediately what time it is. And if all those things are actually descriptive of me, then I should probably wear my watch, right? In other words, if those premises are actually true, then it would seem to follow that I should wear my watch. Now, of course, I'm always free because after all, I'm me, or even if I was disputing this with discussing this set of reasons, the premises are sometimes, from a mental point of view, they're thought to be reasons, right? These are my reasons for the conclusion. That's in the mental sense. But in the written sense, or the spoken sense, or the sense in which we're trying to get clear about how the argument itself works, then we call them premises. Okay, so there's really not, there's a whole category difference between calling P1, P2, and P3 premises and referring to them as reasons. Reasons is an appeal to what's going on in my mind, but now what I've done, and this is actually very important, is there's a real sense in which I've made my premises public, haven't I? Once I write them down or say them out loud, they become externalized. They're outside of my mind, right? I chose to do that. I didn't have to do that. But once I have done it, then the argument is almost like well, it's not almost, arguments are artifacts, right? What do I mean by artifacts? I mean that there's something that mind has been invested in, but once the investment has been made, the thing that contains a residue of mentality exists by itself alone, right? In other words, it is out there in the world as an in principle publicly available object that another mind can gain access to. Now, I have on my desk a coffee cup, I have a bottle of water, I have a few books, pieces of paper. Those are all artifacts too. Okay, so those things, it's pretty easy for us to recognize as artifacts, but it's a little bit more slippery when it comes to an argument. In other words, we think of arguments as somehow being these intellectual kind of almost disembodied items that it's easy to think that because they have that characteristic that somehow they're not artifactual, but in fact they are, right? We write them down. Sometimes the result is a book. Sometimes the result is a constitution. Sometimes the result is a podcast. Sometimes the result is a feature argument in a magazine. They can all of these things and many, many, many more essays, paradigmatically perhaps, they contain arguments, right? This is the stuff, not the only stuff, but the stuff that we encounter all the time. All you have to do is turn on the news for 5 minutes and you should encounter an argument. And the fact that sometimes you don't is actually not a good sign of the state of affairs that we confront, because people should be giving reasons for the conclusions that they have reached. Okay, so you can see that in the above, I have 3 premises, and because of the necessity of there being one conclusion, if it is to be an argument, that whole structure is an argument. So I could, as it were, come up here and say, here is an example of an argument, and it is in standard argument form. Standard argument form. So standard argument form, every element is significant. This is P1 with a colon, and then notice that because this is a declarative sentence, it begins with a capital letter and ends with a period. Could end with an exclamation mark, I suppose, if you wanted to go that route, but I don't see any reason for that here. But what determines that it's a declarative sentence is that it's making a claim about reality, right? That's either true or false. Either I do have a watch or I don't. Now, okay, so there we have an example of an argument in standard argument form. So the examples that I'm going to use to illustrate arguments are just going to be ones that come to me immediately. And consequently, they're likely to be super simple. And that, by the way, is by design. Okay, so arguments are artifacts. Now, I want to stress this a little bit more, because as critical thinkers, at those junctures in your life where you need to think carefully, you're signing a contract, you're going to buy a house, you're going to buy a car, or you're in a courtroom, and it's very important that you say exactly what you mean and you give your reasons for the conclusion that you have reached on a matter. When you're in those environments, of course, if you're the one generating the argument, you want to be very careful. On the other hand, because they are artifacts, keep in mind that it's actually desirable not to think about the author of the article. In other words, I have this cup on my desk that I'm now holding, and the cup was made by somebody, by some company. Some worker actually pulled some lever to get the steel going, and so on and so forth. It happens to be a Contigo cup, right? I don't need to know any of that to know that it's a cup. And furthermore, I don't need to know any of that in order to make evaluations about the cup. So for example, I can say, this cup happens to be made of plastic, rubber, and metal. And that's true of the cup, even though I don't know who made it, right? So your personality, or the personality of the person who put forward the argument, is strictly speaking irrelevant to conducting an argument evaluation. You do not need to know who put the argument forward. So again, I really want to stress this. The cup has certain features that are objectively true of it, regardless of who it was that made the cup. Even if it turns out that an elephant made the cup, it wouldn't matter. To my evaluation, when I say that the cup has certain features, it's brown, it's made of metal, rubber, and plastic, it's cylindrical, it holds liquid. All those things are true of it, even if an elephant made the cup, okay? So that's important, because as you learn to read critically, as you learn to read carefully, you want to find your awareness of the author of the piece, other things being equal, you want it actually to diminish, right? In other words, don't let it get in your way that the author of the article you're reading is, I don't know, Michael Jordan, or that the author is Kendrick Lamar, or the author is Donald Trump, or the author is Kurt Cobain. It doesn't really matter who put the argument forward, insofar as your job is to do an argument evaluation. Okay, so now I'm going to get a little bit silly, and I'm going to produce an argument that you've undoubtedly heard, but that we find kind of cuckoo. I know because I know. Okay. Well, why do you say that you know that? Well, I just know because I know. Okay. Even this rather atrocious argument can be put into standard argument form. So what's the, let's set up the standard argument form. So let's do that. Now I might be stuck with that full line. That's okay. Okay. So what's the conclusion here? I know, aha, that's the conclusion, right? I know. Well, why is it that you know, or how is it that you know? I know because, and because is a premise indicator word. Here's why, because I know, okay? So this is an argument. So you go, well, that's kind of a silly argument because it's circular. This is really in keeping with the principle of charity, that you just, if somebody says that they've given you a reason for anything that they've concluded, the principle of charity requires that we at least take it into consideration and treat it as an argument insofar as we possibly can. Okay, the next step, and I want to recommend that you do this with every argument that you encounter, insofar as you're going to be thinking critically about it. This is the first step. You ask yourself, is it the intention of the speaker or writer for the argument to be valid? Now, this is actually one of the trickiest parts of the whole procedure. And part of the reason that it is tricky is because the speaker or writer doesn't likely even know what a valid argument is, right? So we have to backstep in order to explain this. What is a valid argument? Now I'm going to give you the definition of a valid argument here on the screen. a valid argument is an argument if let me reword this. A valid argument is an argument that is such that if we pretend or assume that all the premises are true, then it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. And this is one of the hardest things for people to wrap their minds around, because we are so concerned with the actual truth or falsity of claims. Okay, so if we look at the above argument, I know because I know, if the premise is true, would the conclusion have to be true? Well, the premise and the conclusion are absolutely identical, so the above argument is a valid argument. Now, at this point, you might look at this and go, well, wait a second, that's not a good argument. It's circular reasoning, and surely circular reasoning is not a good thing. No, it's really not, because you've already assumed in the premises what you're trying to show in the conclusion. So it's not a good argument. However, it is a valid argument, because it is such that if we pretend that all the premises are true, in this case there's only one, then it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false, wouldn't it? Okay, so it's a valid argument. So what this tells us is that an argument's being valid is not the end all of argumentation. Okay, put another way, there are bad arguments that are valid, and there are good arguments that are invalid. Okay, and let's treat all arguments as being either valid or invalid. So every argument is either valid or invalid. Now, there's a little bit of controversy over this way of putting it, so I want to flag that, but I also want to dismiss it rather out of hand at this juncture and just say that definitionally, this is the way we're going to proceed. Think of it as a light switch. Okay, it's either on or it's off. It's either valid or it's invalid. Also notice that we're not saying that the individual claims within an argument are valid or invalid. In fact, remember that all and only claims are true or false. Now we could put it this way, all and only arguments are either valid or invalid. So now let's sort of shore together some of the things that are implied by what we've said so far. What this implies is that no claims are either valid or invalid. Now you'll notice that this is out of step with the way people talk in 2021 in daily life. Right now, in principle, if you do the linguistic translations that would be required, this language and this use of the term valid and invalid has been around for literally thousands of years. When I say thousands, I mean approximately a little over 2,000 years. So I'm advocating for adopting the standard argument, the use of valid and invalid. So in everyday life, we say things like this. I say it too, by the way. I say things like, oh, I think your claim is valid. Oh, I think that claim is invalid. Here's why, right? But when we enter into a disciplinary context, right? Philosophy is a discipline, critical thinking is a discipline. So just as law has its own technical vocabulary, economics has its, historians have theirs, and the list goes on and on. Mathematics certainly has it. So likewise in logic, which is a part of philosophy, we have technical vocabulary. And so the definitions that I'm giving you are standardized so that we all think conceptually of the same items when we use this language. So when we're talking about validity, we're talking about a feature that either is or is not possessed by any given argument, right? It's got to be either valid or invalid. And similarly, if something is a claim, it's either true or false. That means that there are no arguments. That implies that there are no arguments that are true or arguments that are false, right? That's an impossibility as well. Why? Because we said only claims are true or false, and arguments are not claims, even though they are a series of claims put together in standard argument form to form that structure. Okay, so once you practice this, you'll find that it becomes second nature to be able to carry out these evaluations. So let me give you another argument. Let's make it kind of a silly one because it comes to mind. Suppose I say that all blips are bleeps, and then I furthermore say that, how about Zecco is a blip? Okay, so all blips are bleeps, and Zecco is a blip. Now, can we validly infer anything from those two premises? All blips are bleeps, Zecco is a blip. Well, if those two things are assumed to be true, then it would follow that Zecco is a bleep. In other words, if it's true that all blips are bleeps, and if it's true that Zecco is a blip, then it can't be false that Zecco is a bleep. And if it can't be false, that means that it would be true. Notice I say would be, right? So if we're actually suspending our disbelief for the sake of argument, you know that expression probably, right? For the sake of argument, let me just play along and see what you have to say and see where it leads. Well, in this case, if I play along with my rather bizarre friend who thinks that all blips are bleeps and Zecco is a bleep, then I go, oh, okay, Zecco is a blip rather, then it would follow that Zecco is a bleep, all right? So the above argument is a valid argument, and notice something, and I was able to discern that it is a valid argument even without knowing what blips, bleeps, and Zecco are, right? So think about that for a minute. If the premises are true, the conclusion would have to be true as well. And I don't even know what blips, bleeps, or Zecco is. So it's relatively easy to establish whether an argument, at least in a lot of cases. Sometimes the arguments are more complex, and so determining the validity or invalidity of the argument actually takes some extra work. But you can easily grasp the relationship. And one thing that this example reveals is that the actual truth or falsity, play no role in determining whether an argument is valid or invalid, play no role whatsoever. In fact, what I advocate is that you put your blinders on, metaphorically speaking, put your blinders on when you're trying to determine whether an argument is valid or invalid. We are not asking whether the premises are true or false. It's very important. Let me give you another example that will sort of bring that to the fore. Okay, take this argument. Everything that is 9 foot tall or taller is a teacher. Okay. Secondly, Mr. Fike, that would be me, is over 9 foot tall. Okay. Now, if we assume that it's true that everything over 9 foot tall or taller is a teacher, and Mr. Fike is over 9 foot tall, then it would necessarily be true that Mr. Fike is a teacher. Okay, now, what about the actual status? Now, so let's be very clear. The above argument is a valid argument. And if you didn't make that judgment, it's because you let your concern about the truth or falsity of the premises get in the way of your argument evaluation prematurely. Okay, so remember that we said that when we're trying to discern whether an argument is valid or invalid, all we're trying to do is the following. We're trying to see whether or not the following is the case. If it were true that everything that is 9 foot tall or taller is a teacher, and if it were true that Mr. Fike is over 9 foot tall, then if those two things were true, would it have to be true? Could it not possibly be false that Mr. Fike is a teacher? And the answer is yes, that would be the case. Mr. Fike would have to be a teacher if these two premises were both true. Now, what we know is that these premises are both, as a matter of fact, false. So I think maybe occasionally, see how long I go on this video. Whenever the premises turn out to be false and it's relevant that we note that for some reason, then I'll go ahead and put them in red. And whenever premise is true and it's important to note that fact, I'll put them in green. Okay, so green means true premise and red means false premise. So the above argument is a valid argument. Why? Not because of anything about the truth or falsity of the premises. By the way, just to make it vivid, this happens to be an argument in which, while the premises are false, the conclusion happens to be true, doesn't it? Well, I hope you think so. That's what I'm billed as being, as a teacher. Okay, so, but it really doesn't matter insofar as I've only progressed in my argument evaluation this far, okay? Now, the next step that we want to take is the following, I suppose. There are different ways of going about it from here, but I'll just go to this next step. Let's see. Suppose that I have a premise that says, might have to pause here a moment. Let's see. McDonald's food is tasty. McDonald's is nearby. McDonald's is inexpensive. And I'll just add a fourth. McDonald's doesn't require a lot of time to get your food, right? No matter how long the premises are, by the way. Sentences are of arbitrary length. There's no upper limit on how long a sentence can be. So there we have 4 premises. And suppose that I conclude that we should eat lunch at McDonald's. So you can imagine this in a conversation, right? In a conversation, I might go, hey, let's go eat lunch at McDonald's. And you go, well, why? And I go, well, it's tasty, it's nearby, it's inexpensive, and the service is really fast. And you might go, well, okay, I hear what you're saying, but I have a class. And so since I have a class, I don't think that it's the case that we should eat lunch at McDonald's. Okay, so, or you might say, well, I just ate, so I'm not going to join you in your venture to eat at McDonald's. And you have not been illogical, have you? In other words, I've given you 4 reasons to support my claim that we should eat at McDonald's. And they're not bad reasons. You might have qualms with some of them. Like, for example, you might think that that's false. Um, Gee, depending on your budget, you might think I could just make my own sandwich. That might be false, right? So you could do that. And in fact, we do that in real life all the time. We quibble over whether or not the premises are actually true or actually false. But notice that insofar as we are evaluating this argument to determine step one, which is the argument valid or is it invalid? This argument, the above argument, is, can you guess? Invalid. It's invalid. Why? Well, we've already shown that it's invalid by giving counter arguments to it. It's invalid because even if we assume that all the premises are true for the sake of argument, we can see that the conclusion could still be false. The truth of the premises does not make it impossible for the conclusion to be false, right? And that by definition renders the argument invalid. Is it a bad argument? Well, more to come on that. But it's not obviously a bad argument, even though it's invalid, right? Here's another argument of a similar sort. And this one only has one premise, so I don't need to number it. I can say the sun rose today, okay? And then I can say the following. I can conclude the following. The sun will rise tomorrow. Okay, now remember, the secret is don't bring into play your background knowledge. Your background knowledge is that the sun has risen every day since the earth came into existence. Unless you bracket that because Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho and the sun stood still in the sky for an extra day. But putting that aside, it seems to be the case, from a scientific point of view at least, that by definition, the sun has risen every day. Now, of course, we know that there's metaphor involved here, but let's let the sun rose today be shorthand for a full scientific explanation for what happened when the sun became visible in your part of the world today. Okay, now that's actually very little evidence stated explicitly in the premise for the sun's rising tomorrow. So you know that you've been alive for X number of days, and there are quite a large number of days, right? And this, you also know that the sun has risen every day of your life, but those are not things to be concerned with when you're doing your argument evaluation. On the other hand, most people would look at this and say, well, it's not a terrible way to reason. So the above argument is invalid, but not apparently unreasonable, right? However, it is what we call a weak inductive argument. And we'll try to define those terms eventually here. I hope I don't forget and leave that out. Okay, now consider, however, the following argument while we're on this topic of the sun rising. And we say the sun has risen every day since Earth came into existence. I think by definition that would be true, right? So this mound of physical matter, beginning to revolve around the sun is by definition what makes Earth Earth. Whatever it was before then, it wasn't Earth. So that seems to all of a sudden provide lots of support for the claim that the sun will rise tomorrow. In fact, that premise provides a maximal amount of evidence for the conclusion that the sun will rise tomorrow. So how many days is that? Well, according to scientists, it's over 4 billion years times 365. So that's a very large number, isn't it? Okay, so that's an incredibly strong inductive argument. So let me go ahead and say that the above argument is invalid still, but not apparently unreasonable. In fact, as a strong inductive argument, it appears to be quite reasonable from a logical point of view. Okay. All right. So let's see, what's the next place to move to now? Maybe I should go ahead and define a deductive argument, or at least give partial definitions of a deductive argument and an inductive argument. So I haven't really used the term inductive argument yet, although I have, I'm sorry, deductive argument yet, even though I have used the term inductive argument. So let me state the following, which will make it clear why I didn't feel the need yet to mention deductive argument. Okay, and it's this. It's that every deductive argument aims at being valid. Now that's a little bit of something that we call reification in the way I stated that. And that's because deductive arguments in and of themselves don't have minds, they don't have wills. So it's kind of odd to say that they aim at being valid. So, you know, I should say something a little bit more elaborate, like every deductive arguer. Yeah, so maybe we'll change that. And hey, revision is no shame. Revising is the stuff of a critical thinker's ability to progress successfully. So let's think about that. Every deductive arguer aims at, let's say, her argument being valid, right? And in fact, let's see, in fact, every deductive, every valid argument is a deductive argument, okay? So that's the path towards a good argument on the deductive side. When I say side, I mean deductive versus inductive. So if an argument is deductive, then what you're trying to do is you're trying to put forward an argument that is valid. Now, there are many deductive arguments that are not valid. Why? Because I shouldn't say very often, although it probably is the case, but sometimes a person says, no, if you assume that these premises are true, there's no way my conclusion could be false. Yet they've engaged in some error of reasoning, or they've simply, let's see, they just feel so passionately about their conclusion that it becomes a matter of wishful thinking. So what I can do is I can give you an example. Here's an example of a deductive argument that is invalid. So that's a very common mistake early on. Students will think, well, all and only valid arguments are deductive arguments. So think about it carefully, that we're saying that if and when you determine that the argument is valid, then it's definitely going to be classified as a deductive argument. But there are some arguments that are invalid that we still classify as deductive. It's just this. It's that all invalid deductive arguments are bad arguments. What do we want? Well, as rational beings and as critical thinkers, what we want are good arguments. So nobody intentionally produces an invalid deductive argument, but they do exist. For example, if I say, if you come to class then you'll get an A. And then I say, you got an A, therefore, conclusion, you came to class, right? So that's an example of an argument that I'll just type it in here. The above argument is, let's see, invalid, yet deductive, because it looks as though the reasoner thought that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true as well. In fact, they might insist upon that, right? If you come to class, you get an A, and you got an A, so you must have went to class. See that? You must have gone to class. Sorry, my grammar's slipping. Okay, so this argument is invalid, however, because nothing in premise 1 and premise 2 rules out the possibility that there are other ways to get an A in the class. For example, it might be true, by the way, wouldn't it be nice if that were true? All you had to do is come to class, you get an A. And then, but even if that were some very magnanimous, generous, and also irresponsible instructor's policy on grading, even if that were, they may also have other means by which you could get an A in the class. So suppose that you didn't go to class, but you scored an A on all the exams. Well, for all we know, for all that's stated in the premises, it may be the case that such is the instructor's policy, and consequently, you could have gotten an A just by acing all of the exams. By the way, for the sake of completeness, let me add the following. If you come to class, then you'll get an A. And then I say, you did come to class. And then I said, you'll get an A. That, so now I have to make sure I don't screw this up in the way that it is presented. I'm going to cut this here and put this here so it's clear that this is the one. The above argument is invalid, but this argument, you may have to stare at it a minute to see the difference, but just take a peek and you will catch on. The above argument is valid, even though it might not be very likely that this is your teacher's policy, and it's certainly not my policy, right? But that's irrelevant to determining the validity or invalidity of the argument. So if in fact it were true that just by coming to class you get an A, and you did go to class, then you would get an A. And if somebody told you that if you come to class you get an A, and you went to class and they didn't give you an A, then they would have lied, either lied or not reasoned critically, and they might want to revise their syllabus. That's not conducive to real learning, to just say that you have to be in class to get an A. Okay, so the nice thing is that this is being recorded, and so you can review that if you need to. So what is an inductive argument? An inductive argument is an argument that in the best case scenario contains premises that render the conclusion highly probabilistically true. Okay, don't know why it doesn't like my spelling of probabilistically. I do spell it wrong. There we go, I fixed it. I use my spell check. Okay, an argument that in the best case scenario contains premises that render the conclusion highly probabilistically true. In other words, it is never the case with an inductive argument that no matter how much evidence there is in the premises for the likelihood of the truth of the conclusion, that conclusion must be true. right? There's some gap. So if you look up above, best case scenario example that we had presented here was this one, right? This one is highly probabilistically true. The conclusion is, given that the premise is true, right? If it's never, there's never been a counterexample to the sun's rising, then it is extraordinarily likely that the sun will rise tomorrow, right? We kind of have an animal faith, as the Indian American philosopher Santiago once put it. He said, Santayana, sorry. He said that we have an animal faith in the connection between this particular premise and this conclusion, even though there is always lingering the possibility that the conclusion will not be true, even if the premise is true. In fact, all you have to do is think about the fact that one day the earth will no longer be, the sun will die, and by that time the earth will no longer be. And so one day that premise will still be true, but guess what? That conclusion will be false, right? So that's one way of actually seeing it. Okay, now I could say more about that, but I won't for the time being. Now, what else might be useful? I'm always trying to think of what would be useful to tie things together. So you'll notice that because an inductive argument is such that even in the best case scenario, the premises can be true and yet the conclusion could, under some imaginable set of circumstances, be false, that no inductive argument is a valid argument. But that's okay. Why? Because we reason non-validly to strong, I should say, to true conclusions every day, or a lot of days. I don't know, maybe I'll just leave that in. Might be wrong about that. Maybe we don't do it every day, but we do it frequently, right? Okay, so again, there are a lot of good arguments. In fact, the argument that I put above strikes me as a good argument, right? The sun has risen every day since Earth came into existence. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. Seems to me like a very good argument. Now, what do we mean? What do we mean by a good argument? Okay, in order to explain this, I should give you one more example of an inductive argument that meets the criterion, that is the standard specified above, and yet that is not a good inductive argument. Okay, so here goes. So let me be a little bit creative here and hopefully I'll say this right. So in the course I happen to be teaching right now, it's a 5-week class. We have had 2 student hour meetings, okay? So I give 1 student hour meeting per week. There are 5 weeks, and so there are 5 student meetings in total. So, so far I've only given 2. So suppose that I argue as follows. I'm going to give you a few. Okay, I have held student meeting hours for the past 2 weeks. Okay, and I'll just make that the only premise. And now I conclude from that I will hold the next 3 student meeting hours. Okay. Now, when we talk about highly probabilistically true, we're talking about the relationship between the evidence provided in the premises and the total claimed by the conclusion. So if you look at this, the premise contains only 40% evidence for the truth of the conclusion. Since it's under 50%, it is classified as a weak inductive argument. Okay, so 50% or more, we'll go ahead and call those strong inductive arguments. Under 50%, we'll call them weak inductive arguments. So a weak inductive argument, by the way, probably can read this one off its face, but a weak inductive argument is a bad argument. Remember that we want good arguments. Okay, so now, suppose I say I have held student meeting hours. I guess that's what SMH stands for, I forget. Okay, I have held student meeting hours for the past 3 weeks, and therefore I conclude that I will hold the next 2 student meeting hours. Okay, now what's the status of that? Well, first of all, we notice, let's practice. We notice that it's invalid. Why? Because the premise could be true, and yet the conclusion could be false. And that's true of not only both of the arguments that are presently on the screen, it's true of every inductive argument. There's always a gap, right? So they're all invalid. However, this argument, the above argument, is a strong inductive argument. It's strong because the premises provide over 50% evidence for the conclusion. Now you might be tempted to say, well, glory be, it's a strong inductive argument. Surely that argument is good. And the answer is, it is not a good inductive argument. Why? In this case, it's because that premise is false. Okay? So, and this conclusion, by the way, so many conclusions in real life, is indeterminate at this time, right? I don't know. So the rational thing to do, the logical thing to do, is to say, I don't know whether that conclusion is true or false. So what I do is I hold it in abeyance. I think I say on the front page of my own website that I hold it in abeyance. Okay, let me see if I think if I go there, it'll take me off the screen I'm sharing, but that's my website, larryfike.net. Little plug for me right there in the middle of this talk. Okay, the above argument is a strong inductive argument. It's strong because premises provide over 50% evidence for the conclusion. However, the argument is a bad inductive argument because not all of the premises are true. And obviously, in this case, we only have one premise. But now the question should arise in your mind. I hope it does. Well, if a strong inductive argument, look, if I go up to somebody and I go, wow, good logic. Your reasoning is strong, and you've just put forward an inductive argument. All inductive arguments are either weak or strong, by the way. No deductive arguments are characterized as weak or strong. So if you've called an argument weak or strong, then it must refer to an inductive argument. Okay, and that's important because notice that as you get more sophisticated and you go on with your life, you become a lawyer or a doctor or a rock star or a CEO or an astronaut. If everybody spoke this language, then I'd say, oh, you've got a strong argument there. then everybody would know that, first of all, we're talking about an inductive argument, and they would also know that there's one more question that needs to be asked. And that question I'll put up here like this. Yes, it is a strong inductive argument, but is it cogent? Yes, it is a strong inductive argument, but is it cogent? So what is a cogent argument? A cogent argument is a strong inductive argument that has all true premises. Okay? A cogent argument is a strong inductive argument that has all true premises. And furthermore, a cogent argument is a good argument. Okay, it's one type of good argument. It is the type of argument that is good insofar as the evaluation of the argument has led you down the inductive path. So we can put this really simply by saying, if your argument is an inductive argument, then your aim is for it to be cogent. Now, we haven't said what a good argument looks like insofar as your reasoning is deductive. So we have to close that off. And by the way, we're getting close to the end here. Okay, so if your argument is an inductive argument, then your aim is for it to be cogent. Why? Because a cogent argument is one type of good argument. The assumption I am making is that as a being capable of rationality, you are the being, right? As a being capable of rationality and logicality, insofar as you are reasoning critically, you are trying to aim for that which is good, right? So if you're logical, you're being rational, and you're arguing, then what you're trying to do is you're trying to produce a good argument. If the argument is inductive in nature, then you want it to be a cogent argument. All right, and we've seen that there's a step beyond just being strong in the case of an inductive argument. In addition to being strong, it must also have all true premises. Now, I want to make a note here on epistemic modesty. In many cases, you may say, gee, I know that this is a strong inductive argument, but I'm not 100% sure that the premises are all true. So I cannot assert with certainty that the argument is cogent. But I do know that it would have to be cogent for it to be a good inductive argument. See that? I know it's a lot of verbiage, but what that does is what we could certainly use a lot more of, not just in US society at this, as of the time of this recording, but around the globe, is we could use a lot more epistemic modesty. In other words, sometimes reasonability requires us to be humble about what we actually do know. So remember that the arguments themselves are artifacts. They have an existence independent of us. So let's go back up real fast to that argument about the earth and the sun, right? So here it is. The sun has risen every day since earth came into existence. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. Well, look, I think that's a cogent argument, but I'm not going to belabor the point because I'm not an astrophysicist. And even if I were, and this is actually very important as well, even if I were an astrophysicist, the likelihood is that I would only be committed to saying that given everything that we have learned or that we think we've learned about the universe, that premise is highly likely to be true. But you know, I don't know, maybe Joshua in the Battle of Jericho did hold up, something went haywire for one day, in which case it may not have been the case that for every 24-hour period, the sun and the earth behaved in the way in which we typically assume that they behave, right? So there's always room for epistemic modesty, or nearly always, and I won't even try to elicit a case where there isn't any. Some would provide definitional examples, but I'm not going to do that in this talk, which is going to be long enough without my adding to it. Okay, so there's my little proviso or plug for epistemic modesty. Okay, now, what is a good deductive argument? A good deductive argument is an argument that is both sound and also, I'm sorry, I want to say that is both valid and also sound. Okay, so you can't find a sound argument that's not valid. So sometimes students will say, I've got a strong inductive argument here that's also sound. And I go, well, can't do that, right? Because remember that only, let me actually make it explicit, only deductive arguments that are also valid can be candidates for soundness. In other words, I think at least in my courses, I give an example involving baskets. And I say that, you know, you can't get down to soundness unless you passed successfully through the basket of deduction, then the basket of valid, and then a subset of those arguments that are valid are also sound. Okay, so the way this looks is, it's deductive if the intention of the reasoner is for the argument to be valid. Then let's say that they didn't goof in their reasoning and it actually is a valid argument. And then if it passes through the validity segment, then it may be sound, but it may also be unsound. And then if it's sound, then and then only is it a good argument, a good deductive argument. Okay, so let's come up with a definition for soundness, and then once we've done that, I'll put up an example of a sound argument. So a sound argument. Now, what do you know immediately when I say a sound argument? You know that it's deductive, right? Because of the above. A sound argument already implies that it's a deductive argument. A sound argument is a valid argument with all true premises. Okay, a sound argument is a valid argument with all true premises. So, so that implies immediately that only deductive arguments are candidates for soundness. So what's an example of this? I hope I may have to revise, but that's okay. Again, I remind you that correcting yourself is part of the game of becoming a good critical thinker, and I am speaking and typing off the top. And so hopefully I'll be able to come up with a sound deductive argument or a sound argument, which by implication is automatically deductive. So no inductive arguments are valid. And we know that as a matter of definition, right? So if you think through the above, you'll see that no inductive arguments are valid. If it's valid, it's automatically a deductive argument, okay? No inductive arguments are valid. No sound arguments are, is that going to work? Oh boy. Usually I know this right off the top, but so no inductive arguments are valid. No sound arguments, oh, that's not even right. Okay. So no sound, how about, this is the tired stage. No inductive arguments are valid. All sound arguments are valid. Hopefully this will work. Therefore, it follows that no sound arguments are inductive arguments. Oh, thank goodness it worked. Do you see that? So no inductive arguments are valid. That's true. That is in matter of fact true, right? It's true by definition. Let's see if there's a way I can make it stay there without violating any of my principles. How about this? True by definition. Okay, and then all sound arguments are valid. That's also true by definition. Now, if this were true, which it is, no inductive arguments are valid, and yet all sound arguments are valid, then it would follow that no sound arguments are inductive arguments, right? So this conclusion is implied because if these things are true, it has to be true. There's no way for it to be false. And in fact, these are actually true. And so what we have here is the above is a sound argument, and therefore the above is a good argument. Okay? And let's go ahead and let's do a little work on this one. So in this case, all of the elements of this argument are in fact true. Now, if I wanted to be a purist, and I'm tempted to be, then what I do is I'd have to get rid of all the green, right? Remember I said that definitionally that the representation by green would only be the claims that are true, right? And so my system of representation is flawed if I leave these things green. Notice how nitpicky I'm being. Why am I even spending time doing this? It's like, is this a part of me as a person? Is it a part of my personality to do this? Not particularly. I'm doing it because of the context in which I find myself. Right now I'm doing my job, and my job is to convey elements of critical thinking. Now, I'm going to actually tell a tale on myself. If I really wanted to be pure, then I'd have to take the green off of this and the green off of this and anywhere else I put it, insofar as I claim that only things in green are representative, that things in green are only representative of claims that are true. But I'm going to ask you to give me a break on those little shortcuts, at least within the argument. I've taken out any of the elements that are not, strictly speaking, a part of the claims and hence not, strictly speaking, actually true. All right, well, you can no doubt see from this brief tour of how to do an argument evaluation that there is a lot of verbiage involved. But if you are given illustrations and you wait until each element in the discussion really clicks for you, that there should really not be that much cognitive effort that goes into grasping the concepts, because they're not terribly unfamiliar in principle to the way in which we talk every day. Yes, philosophy is a very verbal discipline, and when you hear it without examples, it can be very daunting. But I hope that this has helped. I want to then summarize and say, good arguments come in two varieties, and we all, insofar as we are thinking carefully, that is, critically, strive to produce good arguments. The two varieties of good arguments are either sound arguments or cogent arguments. Okay, how do you get to them? Well, if it's deductive in nature, then it's going to be, remember, this is just to get to a good argument, then it's going to have to be valid. And if it's valid, then you have to check to see if it's sound. That is, are all the premises actually true? And if so, then you have a good argument. On the inductive side, if your argument is inductive in nature, now we have the definitions of both types, or at least sufficient characterizations of each type of argument up above. If it's inductive, it's going to be invalid, okay? We already tested it for that. Now, the next thing that it needs to possess is it needs to be strong. And if it's strong, it needs to have all true premises before it can be judged to be cogent, and then that is a good argument. Okay, so what I'd like you to notice is that the only times that you are really concerned about the actual truth or actual falsity of the premises is once you've gotten to the point where you are trying to determine whether the argument is sound or cogent. Most arguments, or I shouldn't say most, you can't really qualify arguments. I suspect they're infinite in number, although a mathematician would probably object to my saying that. But I suspect that they're infinite in number, right? You can drum up any old argument you want. Excuse me. Okay. But you know, if the argument is clearly deductive, but it's invalid, you can just say it's bad. Now, it may be deductive and valid, as we saw in the case of the 9-foot-tall argument, but not be sound because one or more of the premises is false. But to be good, it's got to be sound. Now, with soundness and cogency, epistemic humility is very often called for. And I try to explain that above. In other words, you know, we might say, well, I really think, or, you know, I've done research on this issue, and it does seem like the COVID-19 virus is hitting people of color with much more frequency than it's hitting white people. And then you would cite studies. Let's say you had that as a premise. And let's say your argument is inductive, but you're not, you know, now you're going, okay, it's inductive, it's strong, but I mean, maybe there's this whole area of people who are white, you know, in Australia somewhere or wherever, that have been infected. And so it turns out that that isn't true. Very unlikely, but that's that is why the need for epistemic humility is a good thing to remind ourselves of, namely that we just don't know as much as we could possibly know about the world, right? And that's true in almost every case. And the rare exception seems to be definitional matters. And you'll notice that in my example of a deductively sound argument, I used one that's driven by definitions. So that if no inductive arguments are valid, if that's true, no inductive arguments are valid. And if it's also true that all sound arguments are valid, then no sound arguments would be inductive arguments. That is a good argument. And the premises are true, but they're true by definition. Okay. And so we find it easier to embrace those because even though the definitions are human conventions, they're human conventions that we follow within the discipline of philosophy. And as I said almost at the very outset of this talk, they are definitions that I believe would be valuable for everybody, every member of our species to embrace within their own given language so that we could all communicate more effectively. If you've enjoyed or benefited from this video, I guess I would ask you to go ahead and hit like. I don't think I've ever done that before in a video in my life, but why not? And also you can visit me at www.larryfike.net for more resources, including the sometimes available MoFo podcast. MoFo stands for Mind of Fike, ostensibly. Thank you very much.